Hi girls, and welcome to part 2 of the science of weight loss. So in this video, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the theory behind why energy in and energy out isn't necessarily the only thing you need to know if you're trying to lose weight. So you've probably heard the discussion before around macros and how finding the right balance of the amount of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats that you're eating is really important. And we all know every single diet really works off the manipulation of those ratios. So in this video, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the science of how we actually lose fat, how we burn fat as fuel. It's through this information that we're hoping to kind of set the scene to help you get a bit of a better understanding of how flexible dieting works, which is where you track and make up your own nutrition plan, and how to make the right winning nutrition plan for you and what to do if you're not getting results and you are being adherent. So we all kind of know that it takes more energy than what we expend. So if we take in more energy than what we expend, it does lead us to increasing our weight. And the opposite is true if we want to get lean. We need to be consuming less energy than what we're expending. So I'm going to go further into the science behind this, and also really importantly the role of hormones that govern this. And why becoming insulin sensitive is really the key to long-term weight loss. Meal timing, I'll touch on, body composition, and why building muscle mass is kind of like the most important thing in terms of getting really long-term results, which, again, like going back to what 23W is all about, we are about setting you up so that you're not only losing weight now, but you're able to maintain it and to keep it off. So let's start with the basics of how energy is actually burnt and how it's used by the body and what are the key players. So really there is one hormone that mainly governs weight loss, and that's insulin. And you've probably heard of insulin a lot, and you might know that when we eat carbohydrate foods, high carbohydrate foods, the higher the carbohydrate or the higher the GI, the greater the amount of insulin that's being released by the pancreas. Now, the body always needs to have a very stable level of blood glucose. And so when we consume foods, the body makes sure that it releases insulin to be able to keep your blood glucose levels in check, in balance. So the more carbohydrates we eat, as I said, the more insulin that's actually released. Now, when insulin levels are elevated, we actually accumulate fat in our tissue, okay? And when these levels fall, we actually liberate fats from the tissue, and that allows it to get burnt. And I'm going to go into how that actually works. So obesity is ultimately caused by mostly an imbalance in this hormone. It's not an actual caloric issue. By stimulating insulin secretion, which happens again when we have high carbohydrates foods, it's usually the highly digestible foods, refined carbohydrates, simple sugars. These carbohydrates literally are making us fat. Now, I'm not talking about long-term fat, but even short-term fat. And I'm going to talk about what I mean by that. By driving us to accumulate fat, making us hungry, and then therefore making us more sedentary. Okay, so simply eating less isn't necessarily the answer here. So lots of studies prove that when someone goes about a low fat or a high caloric restricted diet, so that sort of semi-starvation, and they're eating well below their basal metabolic weight, it shows that yes, they might drop in weight, but they have huge decreases in the amount of muscle mass that they have, and generally waist circumference doesn't change that much. And this has got everything to do with the fact that the ratio of foods that you're eating might not be the right ratio for what you actually need to be on. So when you eat while dieting, it's more important to really focus on what you're eating than necessarily sometimes just eating less. Although obviously being in a caloric deficit is important, but it can't be too extreme. And again, further, like extreme diets generally lead us to feeling quite depressed, a bit socially isolated, a bit ostracized. We get negative feelings associated with it. And whenever that happens, we get cold and lethargic. I guarantee it's probably not going to be something that we're going to want to do consistently, and therefore we're not going to get results from it. So it's really important that you understand that the way that you go about losing your weight now, and the way you think about losing the weight, it's going to have to be one that when you get there, you can maintain. So, you know, when we see or hear girls jumping onto like 1,200 calorie diets, which are crazy, so restricted in terms of the amount of calories. I mean, obviously it depends on how your body size. That it comes to no surprise that you're probably going to find that you're going to rebound a lot of that weight when you return back to your normal eating patterns. And again, we don't generally get over fat, or we don't get fat from overeating. We actually overeat because we're getting fat. So, and again, this has got everything to do with insulin. So I'm going to go into a little bit around fat and things that you probably don't know. So fat is actually always continuously flowing in and around our cells, in our bloodstream, circulating beautifully around our body. We are always going through phases of being less fat and more fat in our fat cells. It's amazing. They actually flow quite freely in and out. What changes how they flow is the amount of insulin that you've got in your body and the enzymes that govern, that are stimulated when we have insulin present. So, and this goes on regardless of whether you've exercised or whether you've eaten. So over the course of a 24-hour period, fat from your fat cells will provide actually a significant portion of the fuel that your body will use to burn. So the longer you go without eating, the more your body will dip into your fat cells, okay? So carbohydrates are considered our body's preferred fuel because one, they're most easily digested, and they're likely to be utilized first. But that's actually got to do with the fact that your body needs to keep stable blood glucose levels. So when you eat food, if it contains fat and carbohydrates, it worries about the carbohydrate component first because that's probably what's going to cause the biggest disruption to that homeostatic level in your body. Your body doesn't like to have high amounts of blood glucose. So as carbohydrates are then digested and they are utilized first when you've eaten, your body and they obviously start to appear in on your bloodstream. Your body then starts to switch back over to using fats as fuels once it's able to stabilize your blood glucose levels a little bit more. So the release of insulin, which helps your blood sugar levels to be under control, will actually, your body starts to release insulin before you even started to eat. As soon as you start to think about food, your body's already triggering the release of this insulin. And your liver, in fact, will take whatever fuel is available, whether it's glucose, and it will actually convert glucose into a fat cell if it's not needed. So when you overconsume in insulin, carbohydrates, if it's not needed, it will get converted into other forms anyway. The more muscle mass that you have, the better your body is able to take in excess carbohydrates and glucose and store it as glycogen in the muscle. So that's another big tick as to why more muscle mass on your frame is really important. As your blood sugars levels continue to decrease, more and more fat stored during that meal, so you eat food, fat will go into storage. As it gets broken down into triglycerides, which is the stored version, and free fatty acids, it will get shipped off to the fat cells for storage because it doesn't need to be used. As soon as your body starts to use the use the glucose, it will start to downregulate the amount of insulin and your body will start utilizing some of the fat that your body did put into the fat cells. It'll pull it back out into the bloodstream and start utilizing it and burning it. So we've got this idea that we use carbohydrates first and then fats second, okay? And our fat cells really are energy buffers. Fat flows in and out of the cell in the form of free fatty acids. They're quite a small molecule. And that's what we use to burn energy for fuel. And when we store fat in our fat cells, it's stored as triglycerides, 3 fatty acids all joined together by a glyceride. And triglycerides are actually quite big. So they need to be then broken apart. So think about like an IKEA piece of furniture. It needs to be broken apart to be then taken back out of the fat cell. So as a result, anything that works to promote the flow of free fatty acids into your fat cell where they can be bundled together into triglycerides, works to store fat and actually make you fatter. Anything works to break down the triglycerides and then move it back out into the bloodstream in the form of free fatty acids actually helps to make you leaner. So insulin dominates this action. And while insulin helps us to keep your blood sugars level and under control, it actually stimulates and orchestrates the storage of our fat as well. So when we have a huge spike in insulin or insulin is released, it actually activates one of our enzymes called lipoprotein lipase. So let's call this one LPL for short. And LPL actually, when it's attached to a fat cell, it pulls fat from circulation and it puts it into storage. So insulin really stimulates and activates this enzyme that will cause us to put more fat into storage. If LPL is attached to a muscle cell, so this is a big bonus as to why having more muscle in our body helps, it will actually help the muscles to burn more fat as fuel. So if we've got high amounts of fat, that's generally why we are less able to really use the carbohydrates in our body. And the leaner you get and the more muscle mass you build, the more you're able to tolerate carbohydrates or high amounts of carbohydrates and actually put them to good use. So this is a really good reason why having higher amounts of muscle mass is a really good idea, okay? I want to just touch on how estrogen actually helps us to suppress this LPL enzyme. So this is quite a common question that I get from a lot of girls who, you know, as you get older, you probably find you start to store greater amounts of fat around the midsection. And going back to where we store fat and around our bodies, you'll notice that men and women store fat in different spots anyway. So men will generally have higher amounts of this LPL enzyme around their belly, whereas females will have higher amounts of activation or accumulation of this LPL around our hips and our bum. And when women get pregnant, it increases the amount of this LPL around those sites to protect to make sure the mother's balanced out as she increases the weight to her front, also to make sure she's got enough supply and energy as she starts to nurture a baby. So this LPL enzyme is actually quite incredible. But going back to estrogen will actually suppress or inhibit the activation of LPL. So as women start to get older, estrogen levels generally will tend to drop, which means that LPL unfortunately will have a much greater effect on the body's storage of fats. Now, we can counterbalance this by increasing the amount of lean muscle mass that we're actually accumulating, because like I said at the start, the more muscle mass that somebody has, the better they're able to utilize insulin. So you generally find that as women get older, they start to avoid carbohydrates. They go, all I have to do is look at a carbohydrate and I put on weight. And look, that unfortunately has to do with the change of enzymes in your body. But there are things you can do to make sure that you are counteracting it. And building lean muscle mass really helps. This also explains, as I said, why men and women distribute differently. I've sort of spoken about that. And I spoke about pregnancy also. So not only do our muscles sort of crave, I guess, protein for repair, but your muscles also look to replace energy that they've lost as well. So this is why when you exercise, that's a really good time to be ingesting more carbohydrates into your diet, because that's when you'll find that you'll be more readily able to burn off excess blood glucose levels, and therefore downregulating that LPL enzyme a little bit. So insulin upregulates LPL, okay? So with more insulin, this makes us store more fat, okay? Even if it's only temporary, but if we don't do anything about that storage of fat, it will get turned into adipose tissue. The other enzyme that plays a really important part is our hormone-sensitive lipase. And this plays a significant role in how insulin actually regulates the amount of fat that we store. So HSL actually works inside our fat cells to break down the triglycerides and release them back into the bloodstream. So LSL is actually a really beneficial enzyme to basically do the reverse. But unfortunately, the more insulin we have present, this suppresses that enzyme. So by now, you should start to get a little bit of an understanding that unfortunately, the more overweight that you are, you'll probably find the more insulin resistant you are, which means that when you ingest food, you probably find that your body will secrete more insulin to actually take up that blood glucose levels. And the more insulin you release, the more activation of LPL that you'll have in your body. So when it comes to working out what kind of ratio you should be eating, generally someone who is overweight and with higher amounts of fat mass on their body should be eating a much lower ratio of carbohydrates. And so that could be anywhere between 20 to 30% carbohydrates, and obviously a significantly higher amount of fat and protein in their diet. And the reverse is true for someone as they get leaner. So someone's diet, as their body composition starts to change and their training status changes, you'll find that the ratio of carbohydrates and the role of carbohydrates in their body will also need to change. So as I've developed strength and gotten leaner, that's generally when I find that my body is able to tolerate higher amounts of carbohydrates, and it actually starts to thrive off it. So it's really important that when you're looking at some people's diets, you're not there going, oh, that clearly works for them, that's what I need to do. You really need to sit back and think about how active you are, how much muscle mass you've got, like your history of kind of putting on weight, and all of those things, to then work out how many carbohydrates you actually should have in your nutrition plan. So I'm going to be using your BMR to set you a suggested, and it is only suggested, macro target called a nutrition plan. I don't write meal plans, girls. I think that when it comes to the foods that you eat, you should be taking accountability for that, writing it down, and then reflecting on it. The most important part is that you actually record it. In your nutrition plan, it will tell you how to set up MyFitnessPal and how to start tracking your macros. So girls, if that's what you want to do, definitely jump on board, but by no means do you have to track macros to get results. Follow the journal, plan out your meals. That will certainly help. So I certainly hope that I've answered a few questions about how our body actually burns fat. So our body burns fat as a fuel source, but it only does that when it's able to do so. And that is why lower carbohydrate diets sometimes are the best way to make sure we're getting fat loss occurring. But that's not to say that everyone should be stripping back carbohydrates out of their diet, because the more muscle mass that you have, the more your body actually needs carbohydrates to be working as fuel. All right. And the only way you're going to know that is by testing and by measuring. So please let me know if you've got any questions about that. I hope that that all made sense. Control your insulin, and by controlling your insulin, you'll find that you'll be able to get on top of your weight loss. And that's not to say that, say, having a piece of toast is a bad thing to do, but think about it. If you have a piece of toast with honey and jam, that's going to really spike your insulin levels. If you have muesli with honey or yogurt even, it's going to really spike your insulin levels. If you have oats, it's going to spike your insulin levels. What will bring it down is by lowering the GI of that food. So adding in proteins and fats will help to make sure that when you consume those foods, you've got less of a spike in your insulin. Keeping your insulin under control will help to make sure that you're not up-regulating the LPL in your body and encouraging more fat storage. We want to encourage HSL to be breaking apart triglycerides and making sure that we're using free fatty acids as fuel. So I hope that all made sense, girls. Please sing out if you want any more advice or help on that. And I can't wait to show you the next video.